Welcome to our Stop the Bleed class presented by Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue Services. Today we will be discussing how to stop or significantly control severe hemorrhage before EMS arrives. This is an international program and is taught around the world. Several years ago, it was determined there was no training program for community members to learn how to treat life-threatening bleeding. This presentation represents the current best practice recommendations for how to manage life-threatening hemorrhage. These 4 groups up on your screen came together and created the Stop the Bleed initiative. We do have a variety of other classes. We have 2 CPR class options. The first is a hands-only CPR, which discusses sudden cardiac arrest and how to perform compressions on individuals 8 and up, as well as the use of an automated external defibrillator, or AED. The second option is our adult child infant CPR class. In addition to the material covered in the hands-only class, this will also include performing compressions and rescue breaths on children and infants, the use of AEDs on children, and choking relief for all ages. We partner with the Howard County Health Department to offer Narcan or naloxone use training. At this time, the health department is running all classes. They offer the class 2 to 3 times a month. You can find a list of dates and register on their website. We also have a variety of fire safety and education classes. This also includes smoke alarm and carbon monoxide alarm education. Finally, our Safe Kids program. The main part of that will be car seat checks. You can set up an appointment with our Safe Kids coordinator, and during that appointment, you will learn how to properly install the car seat into your vehicle, as well as properly restraining the infant in the seat itself. If you have any questions about these programs or you're interested, all of our contact information will be on the last slide. Feel free to reach out to us. Every state has a Good Samaritan Law. They do vary a little bit, so today's we're going to focus on Maryland. This law states that if you're an individual who's not licensed or certified in Maryland to provide medical care, that means you're not a nurse, doctor, paramedic, EMT, anything like that, then you are not civilly liable for any act or omission in providing medical aid to the victim at a scene of an emergency, as long as you follow these 3 criteria, and they are really simple. So number 1, the care that you do provide is done in a reasonably prudent manner. That just means you're doing it to the best of your ability with good intentions. Number 2, you do not expect any kind of fee or other type of compensation for your actions. And finally, number 3, once someone who is trained or certified to provide medical care arrives on scene, you allow them to take over care of the victim. Now, with this last point, it is important for you to continue providing care until the arriving medical personnel are ready to take over. So, for example, let's say you're performing CPR on someone. You don't want to stop compressions when you see or hear the ambulance. Sometimes people do this because they know help is nearby, and that can bring a big sense of relief to them. However, you do want to wait until the ambulance is parked, staff have gotten out, they retrieved their gear, and are physically next to you. And at that point, they will verbally instruct you. You can go ahead and step back. We'll take it from here. This law does provide you protection in any kind of situation where you're providing medical aid, so not just severe bleeding or CPR. This will include overdose situations. You cannot be arrested for possessing or using a controlled dangerous substance, drug paraphernalia, or providing alcohol to minors. If you witness an overdose, it's always better to call 911. This course was designed to teach you how to recognize and control life-threatening hemorrhage. We can't do that without clinical photographs that are relevant to this course content. Some of these photographs are graphic in nature and may be disturbing to some individuals. So why do you need this training? Well, the number 1 cause of preventable death after injury is bleeding. So this means it's not necessarily the injury that is causing the death, Rather, it's the amount of blood loss from that injury. So if we can stop or significantly slow down that bleeding, more people will be able to survive. Now, depending on the location and intensity of the injury, somebody can bleed out in as quickly as 3 to 5 minutes. So it is important for you to be able to recognize these injuries and to take action quickly. Where can you use this training? There are many different types of injury mechanisms that can result in serious bleeding. Now, many people are going to think of gunshot wounds or stabbings with this training, but it is more likely that you're going to need to use this in just your everyday life when accidents happen. So maybe it's an accident at home in the kitchen with a knife. Maybe you work in a setting with heavy machinery and an accident happens. It could be a car accident where the window breaks and the glass cuts someone. We can never predict when these accidents are going to happen, and some of them will result in severe bleeding. The goals for today's include first, learning how to identify life-threatening bleeding, and then 2, we're going to discuss 3 different techniques on how to stop that bleeding. Those techniques will include direct pressure, packing the wound, and application of a tourniquet. Here we have the basic principles that should govern your response if you find yourself in one of these situations. So first, you always have to make sure the scene is safe. Your highest priority in any emergency is always going to be your own safety. Next, we are going to get help, so call for 911. We're going to always make every effort to assure that help is on the way before you proceed to the next step. Next, we need to identify where the bleeding is coming from. Depending on the site of bleeding, that often dictates how you're going to control it. Now, once we've located that source of bleeding, we're going to use one of our techniques. Your personal safety is always an important consideration. If you become injured, now you can't help the person, and who's going to come in and help you? The situation has really just gotten a lot more complicated. So the first step you need to take is determining if the scene is safe, especially with these severe bleeding injuries. This means before you even approach the person, you want to stop and take a look at your surroundings. Can you find the cause of injury? Is there broken glass you need to avoid? Is there machinery on that's unsafe for you to be near? Is it a car accident on the highway? If you can determine that the scene is safe, you can then go ahead and approach the individual and begin care. However, you must always be aware of your surroundings. So maybe at first the scene was safe, something changes and now it's unsafe for you to continue to stay and provide care. If that's the case, you are going to need to stop providing help and get to safety. If you're able to, you're going to go ahead and take the victim with you. And then once you reach safety, you can begin care again. Exposure to an injured patient's blood or bodily fluids is our second safety consideration. So bloodborne pathogens are germs that could be spread through exposure to someone else's blood. Now, if you have access to bleeding control supplies, you should always have access to gloves. If that's the case, you always want to use them. I do recommend that you just go ahead and put 2 pairs of gloves on from the beginning. That way, if your top pair becomes ripped or anything like that, you have a second barrier underneath. But then if that top pair also becomes really soiled, it's really slippery now to work with because it's got a lot of fluids on it, you can easily take that off and you already have a second layer underneath. If you are exposed to someone else's blood or bodily fluids, there's 2 steps you're going to take. So first, you're going to wash the area thoroughly with warm water and soap. Warm water is sufficient. You do not need to use hot water. Sometimes people have the impression it's got to be really hot water, and what ends up happening is they can actually burn themselves. So warm water is sufficient enough. It does not need to be hot. After you've done that, you're going to follow up with your healthcare provider, and they're going to help you through any next steps that they decide. Beginning with A, which stands for alert, we are going to call 911. Now, calling 911 is one of the most important actions you can take whenever somebody is injured. That's because it starts the process of getting the trained responders to your incident location. So it is going to be critical that you do make every kind of effort to call 911 or at least direct somebody else to do so. When you're describing your location, you do want to try to be as specific as possible. So it's not always necessarily going to be just an address. If you're at a very large facility, we're going to need to know where you're at once we get to the address. If you have a lot of bystanders around, it is typically a good idea to just go ahead and send somebody up to the front entrance to meet with the ambulance, and then they can help guide it back to the actual location of the emergency. And then it is important for you to try to stay as calm as you can and listen to the instructions that your 911 operator provides you. So the operators are trained really well to be able to walk you through how to start caring for the injured person. This is one of the reasons that they're going to ask you a bunch of questions. They're really trying to determine what's happening and how you can help before EMS can get on scene. B stands for bleeding. At this point, we now need to identify where it is coming from. The sooner the bleeding site is controlled, the better chances of survival. Now, the purpose of this course is to empower you, the immediate responder, to take action as soon as possible while trained help is responding. So first, we're going to need to find out where the bleeding is coming from. Now, here we're talking about life-threatening bleeding, so we're talking about continuous bleeding, a lot of blood, a large volume. It might be pooling under the body. It could be coming out in a pretty continuous stream, or it might be spurting out similar to what a heartbeat would be. And all of these signs are examples that this is severe and we need to get it controlled as soon as possible. Now, a good way to find all of the wounds is by doing a front to back, head to toe assessment. And that just means you're going to start the front part of the person's body, start at their head, work your way all the way down to their toes. You're just using your eyes to scan their body for any injuries. Once you've done this on the front half of their body, if you're able to, you do want to try it on the back part of their body as well. Now, if you find an injury during that assessment, you're not going to stop. You're just going to take a mental note of where the injury is and how severe it is, and then continue through with your assessment. A big reason for that is there's always the possibility of multiple places or multiple injuries that the person is bleeding from. Now, if I were to stop the assessment at that first wound and I treat that bleeding, that's great. But if there is that second source of bleeding and it is severe, then I haven't really stopped the bleeding because it's still coming out of that second wound. So always do a full body scan. Clothing is really good at hiding severe bleeding, especially darker colors. So your black and your navy blues. So it is important that while you're doing your body scan, that you are lifting up clothing, you're looking underneath. Try to really visualize the skin. Now, depending on the location of the wounds on the body, that is kind of going to tell you what techniques you could use to control it. So not every technique we talk about tonight can be used everywhere on the body. So a good way to kind of help you with determining what techniques you have available to you is by placing these injuries into categories. So the first category is going to consist of our arms and legs. For injuries here, we really can do the most with all three techniques that we discussed tonight. You do have the option to use here. And this is the only area on the body that you have the availability of a tourniquet. Next, we have injuries to the groin, shoulder, armpit region, and neck. These are often referred to as your junctional wounds because it's where our limbs and head connect to the trunk of our body. Now, for injuries located here, you can still do some with. We can utilize direct pressure and packing the wound. However, we no longer have the option for the tourniquet. And finally, our last category is going to consist of our chest cavity, abdominal cavity, back, and head. Oftentimes, injuries here are associated with internal bleeding, and internal bleeding can only be controlled in a hospital setting that's going to require a surgeon to go in, find the source of bleeding, and repair it. So for these types of injuries, there's not really a lot we can do besides realizing and recognizing that it is a severe injury and getting 911 started to us as quickly as possible. You can attempt to do direct pressure for these wounds. I just want you to realize it might not have a big effect. You no longer have the option of packing these wounds. That's really because since it's a cavity, you're never going to be able to put enough gauze or cloth inside to actually pack it tight. Our final letter is C. This stands for compress. This is where we're going to start determining what techniques we're going to use. So the first technique we're going to talk about is direct pressure. Now this is the quickest and easiest one that you can use, so it is always a good starting place. At the core of it, you really only need your hands, so if you don't have access to any kind of other materials, you should at least always be able to do this. For this technique, you're going to want to use gauze or cloth if you have it available. You're going to take that, place a couple layers of it over top of the injury. You will then take the heel of one hand, place that on top of the cloth. Your other hands will go on top, and then you're going to apply as much pressure as you can. You're then going to hold that pressure as consistently as you can until EMS arrives. Now, sometimes after a few minutes, we get curious and we want to see, has this actually slowed down the bleeding? Has it had an effect? And typically people want to lift the gauze off and look underneath, look at the wound. We do not want to do that. A big reason for that is if blood clotting has started to form, more often than not, that clot is going to be attached to the gauze. So if I were to lift it up to view the actual injury, there's a really high likelihood that I'm going to dislodge that clot and then I'm starting the bleeding process all over again. I've essentially undone all of my work. The only reason you're ever going to lift up and remove that gauze is if after, let's say, 30, 45 seconds of applying direct pressure, the bleeding really hasn't slowed down, it hasn't started to stop, and you've decided, okay, direct pressure is not working well enough, I need to move on to packing the wound. That is really the only reason you should stop with your pressure and lifting up that gauze. If this is able to control that bleeding well enough, once you've applied your pressure, you're not really going to take it back off. Now here I have a demonstration so we can see this skill in action. Now this individual, she only has access to a shirt, so that's what she's going to use. But really pay attention to how much pressure she's going to apply. So she's found her wound. She's going to put a couple layers of this cloth directly over top of it. Place the heel of her hands over top, and then she's applying that pressure. Now she really is essentially putting all of her body weight down through her arms and onto the limb mannequin. Our next technique that we can use is going to be packing the wound. And this is going to work well for the deeper wounds where direct pressure is just not enough to actually reach the bottom portions of the injury. With this, you're going to take your gauze or cloth. Again, it's whatever you have available to you. And using your fingertips, you're going to begin stuffing this or packing it into the wound. Now, every wound is going to be different, so there's not a set amount of material you're going to use. Instead, you're going to continue adding into the wound until it's packed tight, and that's just a feeling that you're going to be able to recognize when you can't fit anything else in. Once you've got it packed tight, any remaining material you have, you're just going to place that on top of the wound, and then again, you're going to have to apply that pressure down, just like we saw with our previous technique. Now, the reason that this technique works for our deeper wounds, with this direct pressure here, we can see we're not reaching the bottom of the wound, and that's where the bleeding's coming from. But once we pack it full of gauze or cloth, when I apply pressure here, it's actually able to travel down the gauze, and now it is reaching the bottom. So that's why this works for the deeper wounds instead of just direct pressure. Just like with direct pressure, I cannot lift that gauze up. With packing the wound, once you've placed it into the injury, you're never going to remove it. Now, after a few minutes, the gauze or cloth might have become really soaked with blood, and now the wound is not as tightly packed as it initially was. If that's the case, you can always add more, pack it in tight again, and then apply pressure. So you can always add, you can just never subtract. Here we have another demonstration. Now this is going to be a different kind of wound. Maybe this person got cut on some glass. Now she has access to some gauze. The specific gauze she's using is called Clot, and that is designed for these severe bleeding scenarios. So on this gauze, it has a like a material, a hemostatic agent, so it's going to actually help the clotting process occur. She's opening her gauze. She's already identified her injury. You'll see it in a second. And then using her fingertips, she's just taking this gauze and beginning to stuff it down into this wound. Now keep in mind, as you're doing this, it is going to be very painful for the individual. So you want to try to do this, pretty quickly so that we're not causing an extended period of time where we're adding to the pain for the individual. Now she's got it packed tight, the rest went on top, and then again she is applying that hard pressure all the way down. And you will hold that pressure until EMS arrives. And finally, our last technique is going to be using a tourniquet. So a tourniquet is a device that puts pressure on the blood vessels above the site of a serious wound, and that's going to stop the ongoing bleeding. So when a tourniquet is properly applied, it prevents all blood from getting to the injury, and therefore it can never exit the body. So we want to place these devices about 2 to 3 inches above the wound. Another way to think about it is you're putting it in between the person's heart and the injury. So that way the blood that the heart is pumping can never reach the injury and exit the body. You do want to avoid placing them over the elbow or knee joints. So if that happens to be in that 2 to 3 inch area, just go a little bit higher and go above the joint. You're going to continue to tighten the tourniquet until bleeding stops, and you will never remove the tourniquet. So once it's on, you can just kind of leave it there. You don't have to do anything else. Tourniquets can be applied over top of clothing. Now, with that being said, you just want to be aware of how much clothing. So let's say it's, the middle of winter, somebody's got a shirt on, a sweatshirt on, and a winter jacket on over top of that. In that case, it would be a good idea to at least remove the coat so that you don't have to go through as many layers to really tighten this tourniquet. You can apply tourniquets onto others or to yourself. So if you ever get the chance to practice with a training tourniquet, I do recommend that you try to put it on both of your arms because you're only going to have access to one hand. It can be challenging, so that's why it's a good thing to practice in case you ever find yourself in a scenario where you're by yourself and you have to put it on. Tourniquets do hurt. They actually hurt a lot, so just be prepared for that. That kind of catches some people off guard. On a rare occasion, a second tourniquet may be required. If that's the case, you're going to apply that second tourniquet directly above the first. And you just want to ensure that it doesn't overlap the first one. You don't have to use a second tourniquet if you have one tourniquet on and there's still bleeding occurring. You can always add one of your other techniques that we've already talked about. So maybe it's direct pressure or packing the wound instead of utilizing that second tourniquet. Now, before I play this video, there is a rod on the tourniquet that you twist to make it tighter. There's a few rules with that rod. Number one, you cannot turn it more than 5 times. Really, by the time you get to that 5th turn, it's going to be really challenging to continue twisting it anyway. But if you ever reach that 5 twist max, you're gonna go ahead and clip it into place regardless of what your bleeding is doing. Now, just because there is a 5 turn maximum, that does not mean you're always going to reach that. After you twist the rod, each turn of it, you're going to take a few seconds to look at your wound. If bleeding has stopped, you don't have to continue tightening it. So maybe after 3 twists of the rod, my bleeding has completely stopped. Well, it's not necessary for me to continue tightening it then. So I'll go ahead and clip it in and secure the tourniquet. So here she's placing the plastic part against the individual's arm. She's looping the Velcro band through. And then at this point, you want to get the tourniquet as tight as possible. So you shouldn't be able to put a finger in between the tourniquet and the person's arm. Now this point, it is snug around the arm. However, that is not going to be tight enough to actually stop or control any bleeding. So she's now going to take this rod and begin to twist it. And that rod is attached to the internal band inside, so that's how it's making it tighter. So she's twisting it once. She's going to twist it twice. And in this case, that was enough to control the bleeding. So she'll clip it into place. She's going to take the remaining part of the band and just wrap it around nicely so it's secured. And then this white Velcro that you just saw her place up, that is a place that you should note the time that you applied the tourniquet. Now, if you cannot actually physically write it on there, that's okay. If you could try to take a mental note of it and just pass that information along to paramedics when they arrive. Now, the really nice thing about tourniquets is once it's on, you're kind of hands-free, right? So you have your hands to be able to go do something else. That is the advantage to using a tourniquet versus the other 2 options, because with direct pressure and packing the wound, you have to continuously apply that pressure. So you really don't have the ability to walk away or to go do something else. There are multiple types of tourniquets. So we just saw the CAT or combat application tourniquet demonstrated. That is a common one used for military, police, EMS. However, you also have other brands like the Soft T. Tourniquets all work the same way. The main difference is just the clip style. So with the Soft T, you have this triangle end here. You have another one over here, and you have to flip those over top the ends of the rod to actually secure it in place. So if you were applying the Soft T on yourself, that would probably be a little more challenging to flip those triangle clips up with only one hand. Everything we've talked about throughout this presentation can be done on children. There is one exception, and that's going to be using a tourniquet on an individual who's really small. So if their arms and legs are like really skinny, the tourniquet's just going to be too big. It's never going to get small enough and tight enough around their arm or leg. However, with that being said, typically in those scenarios, direct pressure on the wound is enough to control the bleeding. And then just another word of advice, if you ever have to pack the wound for children, just expect them to really fight against you. It is human nature to want to get away from something that's causing us pain. And in this case, you're going to be the one causing them pain. So just, be aware of flailing arms, kicking feet, things like that. It is usually a good idea if you have multiple people around to kind of have one person designated to just talking to the injured individual. And that goes for children or adults. Sometimes just having that one person to be there to comfort the individual, to just kind of help them get through this, could be really beneficial to them. Here we have some frequently asked questions. So what to do with impaled objects? With impaled objects, you want to leave them in. Do not ever remove an impaled object. There's really two main reasons for that. Number one, the object itself is up against the cut blood vessels, and that is controlling the bleeding somewhat. Second, I don't know what that object looks like underneath the person's skin. So let's take, for example, it's a piece of glass. Well, I don't know if underneath the skin the piece curves or if it's straight down, things like that. I don't know the pathway it went in. So if I were to remove it in a different way than it went in, I'm now creating a much bigger injury. So instead, we're going to do our best to stabilize it so it can't really move around. You can do that with cloth around the object, really at the base of it when it enters the skin. Cloth, gauze, just something to kind of stabilize it. And really just make sure that it's not moving, it doesn't get bumped, things like that. When it comes to improvised tourniquets, the number one thing you have to recognize is they are not going to be nearly as effective as an actual commercial one. So don't expect it to actually stop all bleeding, because more often than not, it's not going to. You're just not able to get it tight enough. Now, some objects that you want to avoid using as a tourniquet are going to be anything thin. So wire, rope, things like that. The thin stuff, especially wire, as you tighten that around somebody, it's going to start to cut into their skin. So now you're not only creating an injury, but two, it's not actually effective because it's not creating that pressure to compress the blood vessels. Two objects that would be good as an improvised tourniquet are going to be a belt, like a wider belt. And then there is a technique you can use cloth and like a makeshift rod, so to speak. You put the cloth around the person, you put the rod on top, and then you can use the rod to twist the cloth and get it really tight around the person. Both of those are pretty good options. Keep in mind, you might have to combine one of your other techniques with it though. We do get asked about the loss of an arm or a leg. That typically comes up when we speak about tourniquets. Because the tourniquet is cutting off all blood supply below it, if it is on for several hours, there is always the potential that somebody could lose their arm or leg. However, we're not going to let that possibility prevent us from using a tourniquet when it's necessary. It's not going to matter what kind of damage it does to an arm or a leg if the person doesn't survive, if they, die from blood loss. So it's always going to be better to control it and not worry about what could come. And length of time, it would have to be on for an extended period, like hours. We're talking 10, 12 plus hours. So a really long amount of time at this point. And finally, pain. Pain we've kind of touched base on throughout the class today. Everything from the injury itself to the 3 techniques are going to be painful. Unfortunately, that's something that we really can't fix, just kind of it's going to happen. It's always a good idea to kind of give the person a warning, you know, like, hey, I'm really sorry, this is going to hurt, but we've got to get this bleeding under control. Unfortunately, there's just not much that can be done about the pain. So a quick recap of what we've discussed. Always, always, always protect yourself first. Your personal safety is your top priority in any kind of emergency situation. Then we have our ABCs of bleeding. So A stands for alert. We want to call 911. That's the biggest, most important step you can take. B stands for bleeding. This is where we have to find out where it is coming from. Good way to do that is that front to back, head to toe assessment that we discussed. Finds all injuries, place them into categories based on location. So your arms, legs, your junctional wounds, and that's your neck, armpit, shoulder area, and groin. And then finally the body, which is your chest, abdomen, back, and head. Once we know where on the body it's located, our last letter C stands for compress, and that's where we're going to decide what technique to use. Now, earlier I did say it's always a good idea to start with direct pressure. The one exception to that is if you have multiple injuries and you can control one with a tourniquet. If that's the case, go straight to the tourniquet for that one, get it controlled, and that way you have your hands available to handle the second injury or whatever the case is. And then you're just going to wait for help to arrive. The only thing more tragic than death is a death that could have been prevented. On the Stop the Bleed website or bleedingcontrol.org, they have put together these bleeding control kits. So if you're interested, you can check them out on their website. You could also just create your own kit. So whichever option you really want to do, they're both good. When creating your own kit, it's a good idea to always have some gauze available, compression bandage or like an ACE bandage. If you're interested in a tourniquet, you could grab a pack of those, and then multiple pairs of gloves. So here's their website, bleedingcontrol.org will take you to like their shop or their store, and stopthebleed.org. You'll learn more information about their initiative, events, things like that. So thank you all for coming to our Stop the Bleed class. If you guys do have any questions at any point, feel free to reach out to us. You can email us at outreach@hcdfrs.org, or feel free to go ahead and give us a call at 410-313-2016. Have a good day.